Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So it's a great pleasure to introduce John Coates, or to interview John Coates, the mathematician at Cambridge. John, when and where were you born?
So I was born in Australia on January the 26th, 1945, in the Australian countryside about 200 miles north of Sydney. And the reason why I was born there, I guess, was that my mother's family were Irish, and they had come to the Manning Valley, I guess, a little after the potato famine in Ireland. And my grandfather was English from Ilkley, and he came later. And so his farm, he actually was in the lucky generation that he still got a lot of land, but it wasn't on the Manning River Valley. And so it was one of these smaller side valleys off there. And I grew up. My father had been a high school teacher, but he was, for ill health, he retired, in fact, to part of my grandfather's property. So I grew up there. And
you have memories of your childhood there?
well, very vivid memories.
Tell me.
Well, in fact, my childhood was quite full of tragedy for my parents, in that my father had a series of mental breakdowns, and in fact, shortly after I was born, I had one brother, and so my mother had to manage the farm by herself and so on, and I think this proved too much for her, and so she died when I was 7 years old. And up until that time, my father had been very ill on and off, but he then took over bringing us up, and was in fact very good for about 5 or 6 years, his health, but then he did collapse again when I was about 13 years old, and became very ill again. So this whole period of my childhood was somehow punctuated by this illness of my parents. But the positive things were, of course, that it was totally unspoiled bush then, and there were the sort of thing which doesn't exist in the world today, sort of unlimited wild animals around, and in that sense it was tremendous for a little boy to grow up in that area.
Were you allowed to wander around freely?
Absolutely.
What about all those tunnel, whatever they're called, funnel?
No, I think, like all children who grew up in the country then, your parents taught you certain basic rules, which the one I always remember was making a lot of noise when you walk through the grass to chase the spiders away. But the truth is, nearly all of even though there were these poisonous snakes and spiders around, they were not at all aggressive. So there were no problems that way.
Were you interested in wildlife? Quite a lot of the people I've talked to early on got interested in.
Well, it's strange. It was so everyday that, in that sense, I guess we just took it for granted.
You didn't collect anything in particular? Or?
No, not at all. No. But somehow you saw it all the time. Whenever part of the farm was cleared, or when we had a couple of dogs, we used to go out chasing animals and things like this. But it's true. You just simply took it for granted. You didn't know that the world was going to change so much so rapidly. But I was fortunate because, in fact, I was educated, and my father was educated because my mother's family, who were Irish, even though they came from a very modest background in Ireland, for some reason the women had been educated, partly self-educated, I guess, and they zealously held on to this until my mother's generation. And so in fact my father had, his first wife had died, and so he married an aunt of my mother's. And so that's why it was through her influence that he was educated. And then similarly it came on then, I guess it's through his influence and my mother's that I was educated beyond the basics that everyone else did.
I think you early learned a love of poetry from...
Absolutely. In fact, you see, it's very curious. I had no idea of much of mathematics or anything then, but they probably partly because they were self-taught. They were interested in literature basically, and so there were all the English classics were around there, and the Irish classics. And they were very interested in people like Yeats and Synge and so on. And it was very nice as a child. It's true, we also went, there was a little public lending library in Taree that we used to go to as children too. My father used to take me there. But still, it really was somehow this nice thing that had come from the Irish side of my family.
Is there anything more we should know about the character of your father and mother as an influence on you, apart from the tragic circumstances? Your mother died
when I was 7
young.
years old.
So you probably don't remember her, though.
No, I do have very vivid memories.
Was she a warm
Very
person?
much so, yes. And in fact, when she died, I, in some sense, hardly knew my father because he'd been away so much, and she was the person I was close to. But then he was tremendous in those years. The only sad thing, I guess, about my father was seeing him become very ill later in life. But I was also very lucky in that in fact, I went to a very small school. The nearest village was about 5 miles away. And I went to a very small school there until I was 11 years old. But then my father, when my brother went off to high school to Taree, my father made big efforts, as this little village school was a perfectly sound one, but there wasn't much. I guess that I hadn't. It was one teacher and so on, so he made big efforts to get me to to Taree Primary School for my last year. And interestingly, it's so crazy, isn't it? But at that time, the rules of the state education authority was that no child could go in a school bus, past a public school. So I wasn't technically allowed to be going by school bus to Taree Primary School, which was, it was a 15 or 16 mile journey, because it went past a school along the way. And my father fought that, and he actually won in the end, and somehow the local school inspector agreed. But then I was very fortunate because the primary school was very good. We had a good class and a good teacher, and then the high school was excellent too.
Whether I don't know how young the mathematics starts, but certainly Neil Turok, who I interviewed, by the age of 3, he was doing quite a lot of mathematics with his father, who was interested in mathematics in some form. But do you remember when you first started getting interested in it?
Yes, you see, it was the opposite with me because neither of my... In fact, I think my mother, she had 1 or 2 mathematics books, and she was probably quite interested, but she had disappeared by the time I was able to do it, and my father certainly wasn't at all. So it was really only in, I guess, in my 2nd or 3rd year at high school where I had an excellent teacher.
Do you remember the person's name? Or?
Jack Gibson was his name, yes. He was, my father, in fact, had taught him French. My father taught French many years before, but he was an excellent teacher, and but I went off, so I went right through Taree High School, and I was again lucky because in those years, I think it was basically the Scottish education system, but it was still in force in the Australian, in New South Wales at least. So we had a good curriculum. I learned some calculus, for example, at school through the honours course. But I think it's true that from my childhood I was more interested in physics, largely because of the natural world. You see, at the back of my father's property there were quite high hills. And one thing that we used to do as children, we'd go back, and some of them were cleared, it was volcanic, the area. So that one of the big excitements was to roll down these quite big boulders down the hill. And of course you get fascinated by this tremendous jumps of these huge boulders in the air. And so I think, if anything, I went off. Of course, I didn't. When I went to university, I had no idea even that there were professional. Of course, I knew that there were a few university teachers in mathematics, but that you could spend your life doing mathematics, it never even really occurred to me.
What at school? Were there other things that you were particularly interested in, particularly sort of hobbies? Were you beginning to get interested in music or sport or anything like this?
Well. It's interesting you say that. I think I had a latent interest in music as a child, but there was simply no possibility. If my mother had lived, then maybe, of course, she was very interested in music. But after that, there was no chance of learning out there. I mean, it was really quite isolated. So that was something which, and in fact, I felt the loss. I like listening to music now, but the technical side of music has always been a closed book to me in that sense. But the other thing that we inevitably got caught up in at school, you can imagine a country high school then in the Australian environment, where sport was a big thing. Course, but it was nice in that there was a lot of camaraderie, and we used to play other high schools, and that side of it was very nice.
What did you play?
Well, the one which certainly played the biggest role, I guess, was I played rugby, but rugby league, yes, but nearly everyone of the boys' team, in fact, it was. There were others who played hockey. There was absolutely no football in that sense at that time. It hadn't come to Australia. And then we swam a lot in the summer. They were the two.
In the sea or in rivers, or both, I suppose?
Well, mainly in the sea. There was a small creek where next to my grandfather's house, where I lived until I was 7 years of age, but it was just, in fact, big enough to learn to swim. So, but then we, of course, at Taree there was a public swimming pool that we used to go down there for sport in the summer. But the wonderful thing was the coast, and it's certainly some of the most beautiful swimming coasts, I think, in the universe. I remember I was very disappointed years later when I moved to California, many years later. And one of the things that had made me choose it was that I thought the coastline would be like the Pacific coast of Australia. This was in Palo Alto I was living. And I have to say I was bitterly disappointed with not the beauty of the ocean, but as a place to swim. It was no comparison to...
Yes, they are lovely beaches.
Another memory I have, interestingly, since we mentioned it earlier, is that my mother used to have a house at Port Macquarie.
Really?
But it was sold, I suppose, perhaps when I was about 5 years old. But up until that time, I have very nice early memories of going there, and also my mother's sister. And after my father became very ill, I spent a lot of time living with her.
Hmm.
But at that time, she was living at a place called Pappenbarrow, which is behind Warhope.
Well, my stepdaughter lived in Pappenbarrow Road, which was the road up from Warhope, so it must have been very...
No, it's exactly that. It's the road which goes up there. So you see, her husband had, I guess, emigrated from England to Australia and then joined the Australian Army in the First World War and been very badly wounded. And he had been given a soldiers' settlement farm in Pappenbarrow. But I suppose the truth was he was really too ill to work it. And in addition, there were the problems of the Depression. You see, most of those soldier farms were abandoned because of the Depression in Australia. But still, they kept it, and I think that's one reason why my mother had this house there, so that her sister could come down to the ocean. So I have very nice memories.
You must have gone past their house many times.
Probably, yes.
410 or something, Pappenbarrow Road. Anyway, the last thing perhaps about school is that this is sometimes the age when people are at their most religious, but not always.
Isn't that interesting that you say that? Yes.
I wondered whether, or it's shortly after school that you sometimes go through a period when you question your religious background. What were your parents or your views on organised religion at this time?
Yes, it's quite a complex question. That both my parents, my mother, the Irish side of my family were Protestants, even though they were from Southern Ireland, and in some sense I think they were quite religious. And my mother used to, I can remember when you talk about, do I have strong memories of my mother? I can remember as a small child feeling very, not upset, but sort of put out because she would go to play the organ in the little local church and I wouldn't be able to sit next to her, this type of thing. And at that time, I suppose, too, there was, they had come. I mean, it really, I suppose they couldn't have survived without religion. You see, they come to this virgin bush, and it was natural that they built a church, and they were, of course, that generation of people in Australia too, who had nothing when they came, knew they would never go back. So all of, I think, religion was very much part of their English heritage almost. And it's just like later on in life you see what happened in India, how important Christianity was there to the English in India. So it was quite powerful, but of course the whole of that Australia and that countryside, everything was changing as I grew up. That there was for example, even the Pacific Highway when I grew up was still a dirt road. When I was a child, it was still a dirt road. But everything, the prosperity that came in the Menzies era, you see, was beginning to change things. So. But I have to say, I never had any really strong... My aunt, my mother's sister, sort of tried from time to time to, with the very best intentions, to somehow bring me more into the fold of the church, and my brother ended up quite religious as a result. But no, for me it was never a strong factor. No, that's perfectly true. Yes.
And still isn't.
Well, I think you see, that's a very complicated question. Certainly, any of these. Like, for example, I'm not a believer in the Christian religion, but I think one of the really interesting things about number theory is that it's so full of mysteries and unexplained beauties that you are conscious that there is something out there in the. But it's nothing beyond that. I guess of all the organized religions that have intuitively attracted me the most, Buddhism is the one, but it's more the beauty of Buddhist art and the fact that in Buddhism people tend to think and meditate much more than is much closer to actually mathematical work, I think.
So your answer about the beauty and the mystery, very similar to Einstein's comments on religion, that he didn't believe in any particular manifestation or organized religion, but he did believe in the wonder and mystery of something outside himself.
Absolutely, I would certainly totally feel the same way, yes. And I mean, in that sense, I think we're very fortunate to be able to spend our lives in which you see this type of thing. You see. I think it is one of the big charms of mathematical work, to see that very clearly.
Well, we'll probably come back to that later. When you finished at school, what did you then go on to do?
Well, it was, of course, I wanted to go to university the next year, and the one problem was getting money. There was also the fact that I guess life on the farm had been, because of my father's illness and so on, and that we were just living out there by myself, that I really got to the point that I wanted to get away from home. Without, I mean, I was still terribly attached to my father and everything else, but it had been very difficult. And so what I did was that and of course I knew my father could not afford to send me to university, so it was clear I had to get a scholarship of some kind. But as soon as school finished, I took a summer vacation job at BHP in Newcastle, Broken Hill, the big mining company.
Oh, yes.
And in principle, well, one of the attractions was, as I say, I just wanted to get away from the bush and somehow meet different people and everything else. And this was one of the few practical ways that I could do it, because I guess they advertised in the school that they gave summer internships. And so I went down to Newcastle and started this job, maybe in I'm not sure exactly when it was, but sometime in December, I guess, after school had finished, after the leaving certificate. And I must have worked there until the until our leaving certificate results came out. And it was a very interesting experience, and in fact they saved me in some sense. Because if I had so what happened is they took a lot of people, I guess there were probably about 30 of us who came as to these internships. And then I think they chose at the end of the period about 2 or 3 that they would then fund through university, and you then went to university in Newcastle, I think was the idea. And you worked for them in the summer. And I don't know whether they saw that I was ill-suited for the work or whatever, but they did not choose me. But then that was more or less at the same time as the leaving certificate results came out. And I had applied for several scholarships, but one of them, which had been pointed out to me by the teachers at Taree High School, was that the Australian National University, which I didn't even know existed, had just started, they were just starting that first year, or maybe it was the second year, to take undergraduates. Before that it had been purely a research institution. And so they had some very well-funded scholarships that they had advertised, and I had applied for one of these. And I guess within maybe a week or 10 days of the leaving certificate results coming out. And when I was feeling very disappointed in Newcastle, wondering what on earth how I would get off to university, I got a telegram from Canberra saying to come down for an interview. And I guess that changed my whole existence then, in that I went, I'd never been to Canberra in my life. I'd often been to Sydney with my father, not often, but we used to go perhaps once a year. And it of course, it was a totally new world, as you would imagine. We were put up in, and at that point, the university had excellent funding. They had this I don't know if you've been there, Alan, but they have this campus right in the centre of this. And Canberra was tiny at that time. It was like a sort of large country town, not all that much bigger than Taree, but they were very nice to us. And if memory is correct, when we were interviewed, I think Howard Florey actually was present, at least for part of the time, because he used to come out as a visitor. He was the chancellor, I think, of the university, but I think it was Howard Florey who actually, and it must have gone, I think they brought down 20 people and they gave 10 scholarships. And we were all interviewed in one day. And then I went back on the train, a long train trip back to first Sydney and then up to Taree, just wondering, would the telegram come?
And it did.
And it did, yes. So,
and to read what? What subject were you going to read?
well, again, you see, as typical of Australian universities then, firstly, there was nothing like medicine at the ANU. I mean, there probably still isn't, I think. But at that time, you either took a straight arts or a straight science degree. So, in my case, I was going to read mathematics and physics and chemistry, general first year. And I think it's true that my feeling at that time, I had, as I say, it was all a completely new world, but I thought it was probably physics that I would do. Partly because, of course, you were conscious more, I had not much contact with mathematics, but apart from this excellent teacher. But also, physics had a higher profile because of everything. I mean, we all knew about the nuclear side of things. And even when we went down there, I think we were taken over because in the ANU there was, Oliphant had his big accelerator that he'd been building for 15 or 20 years, I think, already. And it all seemed to be, that's what science seemed to be. And then in my first year at the ANU, the truth was that the physics was not so well taught, and the mathematics was extremely well taught. And I guess it was from that first year onwards that I really felt that I would do mathematics, and I was very fortunate that at that time, again, they had just set up, because of this, the departments were just being set up in the undergraduate side of the university, but equally the ANU had decided to set up a department of mathematics in the research school. And so they were recruiting people, and I was very fortunate that Bernard Neumann came from Manchester. There were 3 German refugees who played a big role in my...
is that Neumann, N-E-U-M-A?
Double A, yes.
Yeah.
So that he and his wife, Hannah Neumann, so he became the head of the department in the Institute for Advanced Study of the ANU. And his wife, Hannah Neumann, agreed to take on, they both worked in a similar part of group theory together, but she became the head of the undergraduate teaching side, which was something which she didn't have to do at all. She could have perfectly well just gone into the research school as well. And then they also brought out to Australia another German refugee who'd been at Manchester with them, Kurt Mahler.
M-A-Y-E-R.
M-A-H-L-E-R, like the musician. And he came, so the turning point for me certainly was that I think in the third, maybe it was the second term of my first year, he came over and just out of interest taught us a course on elementary number theory. And it was really interesting, and from that time onwards, I guess I felt clearly I wanted to do mathematics.
Might be very helpful for me as well as the rest of the audience. If you could very simply explain what number theory is.
Yes, so number theory is I guess the study of the deep and hidden properties of the most basic of all mathematical objects, which are the integers, the whole numbers, the integers, and the rational numbers.
What is a rational number?
The ratios of integers.
Oh, ratios.
Like a half is a rational number. And even though these are, of course, a lot of mankind's evolution in mathematics, and partly because of the need for physics and calculus and so on, is that he's kept enlarging the number systems. But it's, I think, true that the deepest and most interesting and most mysterious properties of all in mathematics are there in the integers. So this, because it's dealing with these very basic objects, it's certainly the oldest part of mathematics. I guess only astronomy has, in some sense, has real competition with number theory as being the oldest part of mathematics. And it undoubtedly, you see, it's still true today, and some of the most important discoveries have still been made in the 20th century in number theory by people looking at numerical examples. But historically, this is how it all started, that people would look at numerical data and notice surprising things going on. It certainly started in Asia long before the Greeks, in fact.
Yes, I was wondering how deep the roots were. When you say Asia, do you mean India, China?
Again, we don't know exactly, but probably India. But there was enormous interchange of ideas throughout Asia, as we know through Buddhism and things like this. But it's true, we have in the West, we tend to think of mathematics as starting. The Greeks, of course, made a great contribution to mathematics in that they were the ones who emphasized the idea of an abstract proof. But in number theory, even today, the goal of number theory is to prove these basic properties that people have noticed about the integers. Most of them are unknown, unknown in the sense of unproven. And their discovery was often made long ago. I mean, there is the sort of mathematics I have worked on was a problem. The classic example is a problem that was certainly studied numerically by Arab mathematicians 1,000 years ago. And it turns out to be a beautiful example of the modern theory. And it has practically nothing to do with Greek mathematics. It sort of antedates that. But we don't know exactly where it began or what. But it is the fact that there were certain patterns happening in numerical data that people noticed this type of thing first. You see a lot of number theory in the popular mind, and it is a fundamental part of number theory. A lot of the numerical data has been in connection with prime numbers. So prime number is one you can't factor at all. But I myself have worked more in what we call Diophantic equations, which is of course called after Diophantus of Alexandria, and that's the study of equations in integers. And there you have these very ancient problems that we still do not know how to solve today.
Will we?
We still don't know how to
No, I
solve.
mean, will we ever?
Of course, yes. In that case, you see, there is this. When we were talking earlier about Swinnerton Dyer, there's this he and Birch made this wonderful conjecture, linking these problems to something else. This classical problem is just a special case of it. And I do believe that sooner or later and there's been a little bit of progress on their conjecture, but I think in the end we will be able to solve that conjecture. I think we're all missing something rather simple in the case of this problem, but someone has to find it. So.
I mean, as a complete layman, I mean, to me numbers are things like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Exactly, to me too.
And
yes.
How can there be any mystery about them? I mean, they go on and you can have very large numbers and there's a question of whether they can be finite or infinite. But apart from that...
Well, you see, for example, straight away, the question of the distribution of prime numbers. So prime numbers are 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17 and so on. They're numbers which cannot be factored.
Yeah, cannot be divided.
That's right.
Yeah.
When I say
And
factored.
you factors, yeah.
And it's fairly easy to see, it was probably known long before the Greeks, that there are infinitely many prime numbers. That's not difficult to see. But the question of their distribution beyond that is still one of the great mysteries in mathematics. There are deep results known, but...
beyond what? Beyond...
Well, how many... So the real question is, how many prime numbers are there up to a large... Suppose x is some large number.
Yeah.
How many prime numbers do you expect to occur which are less than or equal to that number? So, and this turns out to be of real practical importance today too. Well, there's another problem connected with that which I'll talk about later, but we do know now that it's very roughly x over log x is the number of prime numbers.
X over
the logarithm of x.
Oh yes, yeah.
Is what this is the so-called prime number theorem. There's a precise statement of it. But that's not really the full answer. The full answer is that you really want to know how much the number of primes up to x differs from x over log x. You want to have some upper bound for that. And this turns out to be a problem equivalent to this, what's often called the Riemann hypothesis.
How do you spell that name?
Riemann. Riemann was because Riemann, it's on the face of it, he was the person who saw that there was a connection between this problem and the distribution of zeros of an analytic function that we call the Riemann zeta function. But in fact it was Gauss earlier who had made a guess that's closely related to the Riemann hypothesis, that in fact pi x was very close to what we call the logarithmic integral of x. And you can make that quite precise and give something equivalent to the Riemann hypothesis. But, so that's one problem. Another problem that's completely unknown about prime numbers is whether there are, so you get these prime pairs. So in other words, you get 3 and 5, 5 and 7, 11 and 13. So two numbers, p, a prime, and such that the prime plus 2 is also a prime. And it's still unknown whether or not there are infinitely many prime pairs. Of course, everyone believes there is, and there's even an asymptotic formula and so on, but it's never been proven.
Fascinating. Well, we'll come back to some of this. Let's get back to the 20-year-old John Coates at university in his, having discovered mathematics and number theory in his first year. Did you then begin to specialise in mathematics?
Yes, I guess in my second year, I think I just took mathematics and physics. I dropped chemistry, if I remember correctly. And then I think in my third year, no, maybe I did do, I've forgotten, but it's true that it was 3 years in which I took progressively more mathematics. And then the fourth year, the honours year, I did only mathematics. And I was indeed very fortunate that I got interested in number theory through the lectures of Kurt Mahler. He came on a number of occasions and gave us, well, he came from the other side of the university. And then I started, in fact, I was able to start research as an undergraduate. In my fourth year, we were able to write an honours project, and he gave me an old unpublished paper of his. It was quite difficult because it was in German, and I only had a smattering of scientific German. But I read it, and it really gave me confidence, I guess, that I could. Because one of the real difficulties of number theory is that it's a vast subject, and there is so much to learn, and the problems, the interesting problems that are left are so hard, that a beginning student, you have to have a lot of courage in some sense. And I think a lot of what sort of gave me confidence to go on then was precisely this sort of time I spent in that year. And he was really very good.
He spent time with you?
Well, in the sense that he gave me this, he suggested that I do it, and I would go and see him, I guess maybe once every week or two. And he made a couple of suggestions, but I was able to do a little bit of original work of my own through his guidance. So that was very good, I thought. Curiously, I also, well, there were various other things, naturally, that happened as an undergraduate that were very...
You fell in love?
Exactly, I met my wife, and she arrived a year after me at the ANU. And so we were there as students together. And that was, of course, very, very nice. And then I guess I got a little bit involved in student politics and so on too. I have to say it was a really, the university was tiny at that time. And for example, Robert Menzies, the Prime Minister, used to come, somehow he really was interested in the ANU. So I have to say a total difference from, of course it wouldn't be possible today, I guess, for an Australian Prime Minister to come along, but Menzies used to come along to the Hall of Residence, Bruce Hall, that he had, I guess, he'd been instrumental in having it built and so on, but he would come along for meals and things like this. And in fact, my wife's father was also a member of Parliament. And this was before too, they were just beginning to build up Canberra, but at that time it really was a small and very charming place to be in many ways.
What was your wife's subject?
So she was studying arts.
Arts?
And she concentrated in politics.
You mentioned politics. Did you go on with an interest in politics?
No, not at all. So somehow or other I got sucked into the student politics, but I guess there weren't. It was a very small community, and the main people who were involved were at the same Hall of Residence, and so I got sucked in a little that way. And again, there were a few things on the national level that I was involved in, but then after I made a deliberate decision at the end of my third year that I didn't have the time to go to do any more. So so I stopped.
And since then you stopped.
Completely. I've had nothing to do.
National politics or international politics?
Absolutely not. I mean, perhaps
College politics, perhaps.
a tiny bit of college, and when I was at the École Normale, I guess there was a tiny, but not really even there. It was when I was in Paris, one had to be a little bit involved in things, but not very much, not at all.
So you must have then gone on to do research. I mean,
Exactly. So again, I was lucky that the ANU had a travelling scholarship that they introduced, just one, and I got it, and partly it was very interesting. I mean, the two people who sort of directed me into what I did next didn't direct me, but they somehow, it grew out of that were Mahler, who was this number theorist, and then Hannah Neumann, who was a group theorist. And it's sort of curious that they were on the opposite sides of mathematics. That she was sort of interested very much in abstract algebra and the new things. And Mahler was of this sort of great German school of number theory. And I think I can say it without offending anyone now, but she told me once, you can't, you're crazy to go into that scene. It's sort of very conservative, very old, very difficult. You should be going into this part of mathematics, you see. And she was a very straight-talking lady. In fact, I liked her very much, but she was a very fine mathematician in her own right. So somehow, because of this tension between the two of them of what I should do, I ended up, they suggested that it might be a good idea rather than, one possibility was to come to Cambridge directly. But the other possibility was to go to Paris, where there was this sort of very vital school of much more abstract algebraic geometry going on. And so that's, and with the ANU travelling scholarship, you could go where you wanted. So, again, Mahler, I think, wrote to some of the mathematicians in Paris, and I was given a place of a foreign student at the École Normale for a year. In fact, I think it was a year initially, and so I went to Paris. But, as you can imagine, it was, somehow it was an experience for me, but it was quite a shocking experience in many ways to go to Paris. For example, I had never lived in a big city. My wife, her family, she joined me after she had to finish her honours year at the ANU, so she joined me after 3 years. But I had never lived, even though she lived in Sydney, I had never lived in a big city before. But I guess the really difficult thing for me was, the language was not too bad. I mean, I had learned, I could read French fluently because of my father, but I had never spoken very much French. But basically, I guess I found I did not have the mathematical background to sort of cope in some sense with the type of research that these people wanted one to do. So I in fact, I became very frustrated and felt I had to change after a year. And at that point, again, I was very fortunate because I guess Ian Cassels had come to Canberra when I was there, and Mahler had talked to him about me, and that's why I had been offered a place in Cambridge. And so I wrote to him.
Ian Cassels?
Ian Cassels, yes.
C-A-S-S-E-L-S.
C-A-S-S-E-L-S, yes, he's still here.
Yeah.
So I wrote to him saying I really couldn't, found I was, just out of my depth in this very abstract world in Paris, and could I come to Cambridge? And he was very kind. He immediately wrote back and said, yes, there's no problem at all, you can come.
How nice.
And so I stayed we spent the whole year in Paris, but then I came in that summer.
I mean, this is just a very general question, but it's been noted that the French are very good at pure mathematics, that something like they've won twice as many Fields medals in mathematics as the British. Is there anything about French society, apart from the wine, to which you can attribute this high ability in mathematics? Or do you think it's a myth?
No, I don't think it's a myth. Of course, I think France did have a golden period in certain aspects of its intellectual life after the Second World War. There was this whole generation of people who suddenly grew up liberated like that, and it was obviously different to what happened in England, I guess, but so that they had a particularly strong mathematics, and they also very much pursued this idea, which is of course very important in mathematics, that one should be more abstract and of course build up mathematics axiomatically and so on, which is still there, but it's something that everyone takes for granted now, you see. But the French somehow had the right people and the right themes, and but curiously, that I was very fortunate because I'd already heard about it when I was going, but at the same time all this major abstract work was going on in Paris. There'd been this great number theoretic discovery made here in Cambridge by Bertrand Swinnerton.
By?
Bertrand Swinnerton.
Yeah.
And that already had, of course people were aware of this the world over, because the leading people immediately became interested. And so that was a little bit in the air when I was in Paris. And I was very interested in it myself, too. So that it was happening in a very different way. And this discovery was made in no sense by because it was about some of these oldest problems, but not by big abstract machinery like was going on in Paris, but by numerical experiments on the first computers.
Maybe EDSAC.
EDSAC and things like this. So there were very important questions going on both sides of the channel. But of course I went back to France later on. I taught in Paris for 8 years. So you question of one of the reasons why there is no doubt why French pure mathematics has been so good. I don't know so much about the applied mathematics, and has been the École Normale Supérieure, which is undoubtedly has been a great training ground for pure mathematicians. Always, but particularly I think since the Second World War. And I guess we all hope it will continue that way.
Can you remember your first impressions of Cambridge when you first came here? It wasn't a big city like Paris.
No, in fact, we did come over from Cambridge to Cambridge once as tourists beforehand. Well, it was very nice. I mean, we arrived in midsummer, and I was a student at Trinity, and they had flats at that time above the Blue Boar, what used to be the Blue Boar. So we had a nice flat there, and then we couldn't stay there when it had already been promised to someone else when October came. But then we had a delightful flat in Westminster College, above the Master's Lodge that they just rented out. At that time, I don't know if you ever knew her, but there was Mrs. Burkhill ran the Society for Visiting Scholars in Botolph Lane. And her husband was a mathematician, but she just helped students who weren't housed by their colleges or whatever. And someone said to her, "You should go and see. They have a list of accommodation." And she sent us up to Westminster College, and we had the most delightful flat there.
Mm.
I often tell my research students that my standard of living has declined ever since I was a research student.
Did you have any of that sense of being out of your depth when you came to Cambridge?
Well, you see, it was completely different. That I then decided, because I only had 2 years of funding left, that the only practical thing for me to do was to abandon the sort of work that I'd been trying to do in Paris and leave it for the moment, and write a PhD thesis much more closely related to the sort of work I had done under Kurt Mahler for my honours thesis. And so that's what I did.
This was an honours degree, in other words, it wasn't a PhD.
No.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I was doing this is my honours thesis in Canberra, and I was there was someone in Cambridge who'd done some very interesting work in that direction, and so I wrote a thesis. As I say, I didn't have much time, but I have to say I'm infinitely grateful for the nice atmosphere in the department then, and
Did you say who your supervisor was?
Alan Baker.
Alan Baker. He's had quite an influence on you?
Well, no, not really, because in the sense that I did what I really wanted to do was the type of more algebraic number theory, and already I was very interested in the conjecture of Birch and Swinnerton then, and Swinnerton was here, and again he was someone whose lectures I attended. It was marvelous then that he had, I guess he was the Dean of Trinity. He lived in Trinity, and he had the room over the gate at the back of the college, so with a beautiful view down there. And I think every afternoon it was quite certainly any mathematics student, but I think any student could come and have a drink with him at the end of the afternoon.
Wonderful. You mean alcohol drink or tea?
Yes,
or?
I mean, it was certainly there was alcohol if you wanted it. So I guess I used to go maybe once a week or something. And he was very open, and I always appreciated it very much. Yeah.
Well, he, as you mentioned, was a great mathematician, but it fits my stereotype. The one mathematician I knew quite well used to say that you can't do mathematics, high-level mathematics, for many hours in a day because it's so intense. So he used to drink quite a lot because he was just really filling in time until he could get back to the mathematics. But he sort of rationed himself to 3 or 4 hours a day of this stuff. Is there any truth in that or not?
I don't know. But by the way, of course, Peter himself drank very little, I think.
Yes.
And he was, by that time, he was doing a lot of mathematics, and did also some very work that was subsequently very important, but he was getting heavily involved in university administration too. But to answer your question, it's...
How many hours a day of mathematics can you do?
Well, it's true that in terms of sort of real mathematical work, I mean, trying to do something new or just working out on a paper, it's perfectly true that sort of 3 or 4 hours a day is probably your effect. You're not, unless you're very excited, and then you can work sometimes for a long time. I find I can't work too much more than that. But then there are all the chores of the academic world, which involve some, like the endless writing of letters of recommendation, or even preparing a lecture and so on. That you the reality is, I think, if one wants to leave time for real mathematical work, you have to be working long hours in the day anyway, and some of it, of course, it would be ideal if we could do it all when our minds were fresh, but it's not possible. And in my case, I often, it's sort of strange, I often find, and I still do it, but for practically all my life, I ran a little bit in the evening when I was mentally very tired. And then I would find, when I was younger, that would wake me up mathematically.
Interesting.
Now I find it puts me, it's very good for one, but it doesn't, I'm too tired to work at night, basically.
Swinnerton Dyer, tell me something more about.
Well, there's just another nice memory I always have of those times that a group of us as research students had bought it came out in the newspaper, this was of course in 1969, so it wasn't so common, but someone was offering, you could buy wine in bulk for Christmas. And we put our money, there was a group of us research students put our money in this. And then the whole operation collapsed. It was some sort of scam. And somehow this got to the Swinnerton Dyer got word of this. I don't know how. And to our absolute amazement, he handed us out a check for the whole, from his own money, for the whole sum.
How sweet.
Very, very sweet. It really was.
He was he's still alive. He's a nice man.
Absolutely charming man, yes.
Very influential in various ways, so I hope I'll have a chance to talk to him. The other Trinity mathematician, it'd be nice to know whether you know of any stories of your predecessor in the Sadlerian chair, G.H. Hardy. There are many legends of Hardy and his ways, and
yes.
What did you hear about him when you were at Trinity at that first time, or any time?
Well, not very much. Of course, I've had very little to do with Trinity, but I was a student there for the 2 years, and
he was a pure mathematician.
Absolutely, he was a number theorist, but he was much more on the analytic side of number theory than I am. No, he's unquestionably a great mathematician. There's no doubt about that.
He worked with another mathematician,
Littlewood, yes.
Littlewood, and he always used to describe Littlewood as the greatest mathematician he'd ever met.
Littlewood also was undoubtedly a great mathematician, yes.
And it was one of the greatest partnerships.
I think that's absolutely correct. Of course, it should be said though, you have to view, from the number theoretic point of view, you have to view, Hardy and Littlewood were great mathematicians, but you have to view it against the background of this great German school of number theory. And they were in the same class as a number of people in that school who lived at the same time. And in fact, they were, of course, they created the subject of number theory in a big way, really, in England. Before that, it was all Germany, France. But you have to think of Hardy and Littlewood against this background of many other great names in number theory, who were, of course, it was all destroyed by Hitler, basically. So, of course, many of them then went to the United States, and but somehow the school was lost in that sense. So Hardy and Littlewood were a splendid part of that firmament, but they're only part of it. Yes.
Like I can't remember who said, but Hardy was about the 6th greatest mathematician in Europe or something, but not the greatest. But anyway, I wanted to ask you about the man who Rama, whatever, the Indian mathematician about whom there's been a recent book.
Ramanujan, yes.
Yes. Was he a number theorist?
He was a number theorist. Yes, of course, he was an absolutely remarkable mathematician, and he was very interesting when I talked earlier about how the examination of numerical examples led to people seeing very interesting general phenomena. I personally think that's how he made most of his discoveries. He just had this sort of wonderful feeling for looking at examples and obviously doing some numerical calculations, wonderful feeling for formulae. And in some sense, he and Mordell, who was also a totally different person, Mordell's another Sadlerian professor, were the opposite of Hardy and Littlewood and the German school, in that they made really great discoveries without perhaps working with so much machinery and
You mean literal machinery or
mental
machinery?
mathematical machinery. Yeah.
Mm.
Of course, Mordell proved this, his celebrated theorem that came out of Fermat's work in some sense, and that theorem is absolutely central for the study of Diophantine equations. The conjecture of Birch and Swinnerton Dyer is about aspects of that, and I've spent my life working on that kind of question.
One feature that captures the popular imagination of people like me of Ramanujan was that he was incapable of explaining how he came to his conclusions. I mean, I imagine this is always the case with complex mental work. I can't explain how I write really, but you know, he reverted to mystical theories of goddesses who had appeared to him in his dreams and told him the answer. But is it a general feature of mathematics that you go into a state where you rise above experience?
No, I don't. I think in Ramanujan's case, it's probably his life and his education had these life presumably revolved around temples and things like this. They were naturally there. I think it's probably true, every mathematician there is some place or some situation or some time where you get a really idea which is very important for your work. And it usually doesn't come through. Of course, to get there, you've had to spend many, many hours of concentrated thinking, but it's true, it often comes just with, someone makes a remark or there's something, it's out of the blue in that sense that it comes. I think that is very true of mathematics. It's certainly true of my own experience.
Well, it'd be lovely if you told us of a case or two in a moment, but I very much admire the work of, or at least the explanations of how mathematicians work of Poincaré, and he tells a story of one of those moments when he'd been working very hard, as you said, on a problem, and then he went off to the south of France for either a holiday or a conference and didn't think about it again. And he explains how, as he was getting on the train or bus to go back to Paris, as he put his foot on the step of the bus, the whole solution came into his mind. And he didn't really think about it again. When he got back to Paris, he wrote it all down and it was there. Just in 1 second, rather like Darwin describes how the ultimate secret of the theory of evolution came in the moment he bumped in the air on a cobble in a carriage, and by the time he hit the seat again, he'd worked it out. Can you think of any?
Well, but I think what's behind this, you see, is that if you're a mathematician trying to solve a problem, there's a whole body of theory that you've been through in any case. And when you can't solve it, there are certain inconsistencies, you see. But I think it's true that if you suddenly see, but of course, if I take a different idea or a different thing, the whole thing fits together. You see, I think it's more that it is ground that you've been over many times, but you can't see the proof out of it. And then you suddenly see that by some new idea or some different way of putting things together, that it does all fit together. You see, I think that's where in my mind, what these people are thinking of. That you, for example, you couldn't have this experience if you hadn't spent hours and days and weeks thinking through all of somehow the detailed mathematics around this problem.
But For instance, the story told of Bertrand Russell walking down Trinity Lane and suddenly leaping in the air, saying, the ontological proof works after all, or something like that, or Bragg walking along and, as a young man and on the backs. I wondered whether there were any situations, often it is walking, or after you've been slightly muffled by an evening's conversation or meal or in a shower or something. Are there situations where you found conducive to these?
Well, I think it's very individual for people. In my case, when I think of sort of what I would consider the most important things in my own work, curiously, it has often been the remark, almost the chance remarks of other mathematicians that have somehow been very important for me. And of course they made those remarks, I think it's fair to say, not foreseeing that at all how it could be useful. They were just comments. But also, as I say, in my case, I have sometimes, I find that I tend to run in the evening, still a little bit. And often, towards the end of the run, something you've been worried, but it's usually not a big idea, it's somehow some lemma or some inconsistency you've been worried about, that I think it's as the oxygen goes around the breath, that you do get some insight sometimes. Yeah. But I do think it's a very individual thing. I think it's like all creative work.
Another fiction or stereotype of mathematicians is the age at which their work is done. That certainly some mathematicians do their very best work quite early on in their lives.
Yes.
Does that depend on the kind of mathematics, or?
Well, you see, I feel I was lucky that in my case I was able to work in the parts of number theory where you were able to really, I think, break new ground, because they were not highly developed. Of course, they depended on work of other people and everything else, but in some sense, I mean, I guess the ideas that I've worked on, the key ideas I had when I was very young, relatively, within 4 or 5 years of my PhD, a little longer. But I think it's much harder today, because something like number theory, with literally so many people in the world working on it, such huge bodies of theory for people to learn and so on. I think it is getting harder and harder. So I don't know. I mean, there's certainly been this argument going on for a long time. I used to be a little bit involved myself when I was on the International Mathematical Union, that whether we should give the Fields Medal has this, it's still the case that it's awarded to someone under 40, but there's been this eternal discussion, I guess, it was already going on when I was involved in the early 90s, so it's 20 years ago almost, about whether that age limit, I think it was a question of always raising it 5 more years, to 45, but this was precisely because there was this feeling that the subjects were getting so big that, so I don't know. I still think that if someone is going to do really original work in mathematics, some of it will emerge if it can be recognized within 4 or 5 years of the PhD.
Let's move on from your PhD. What did you said you went back to Paris? Was that when you went back?
No, not at all. No. So I must admit, when I look back, I think I was very fortunate in many ways. But as I say, I wanted to go back to some of these more algebraic problems and more structural problems. and things like the conjecture of Birchin's written down, because there it was, this beautiful conjecture, but how do you attack it?
What is a conjecture?
Well, a conjecture is something, a number theoretic fact, or even a general mathematical fact that we think is always true, but we cannot prove. So number theory is full of conjectures.
So it's setting a problem.
Yes, but it's more than setting a problem. You're saying that
And a probability.
precise, that this is something which is always true, as far as we can see, that there's no counterexample to it. No.
That, in the wider sense, Popper's sense of conjectures and refutations, all science is conjecture.
True, but I guess you see in mathematics we're really concerned with rigorous statements and rigorous proofs. And I suppose in physics, often, some conjecture about a physical system or something like this that you could perhaps... Of course, that can happen in its own way in mathematics, but especially in number theory, there are these often very mysterious, clear-cut conjectures.
And they had set a conjecture which you were concerned with trying to...
Yeah, this was this. So just the discovery of this conjecture changed the whole of number theory, or a whole of a large part of number theory, in fact, because it was so totally... Of course, in retrospect, like all these things, we wonder now why it wasn't discovered by... But there were hints of it in the German school of mathematics, but they didn't quite... They didn't, certainly they had no specific idea like that. But, so in any case, I wanted to do that. I wanted to do more the type of mathematics I had tried to learn in Paris. And I had the stroke. So the other really... So then I came across the other person who I think who really had a big influence in a very concrete mathematical way in my life. So I was looking for my first job. I applied for Cambridge Research Fellowships and got none. I didn't even get shortlisted.
You're in a great tradition.
So I then, but I knew, and I didn't think I had any chance of getting it, but I knew they had, so I knew I had to look for postdoctoral positions either in Australia or in the United States. And of course I knew, in fact he came to Cambridge while I was in my last year, this person who was in the United States at Harvard, John Tate. John Tate.
Tate.
He was somehow the leading American proponent of algebraic number theory. And he did come here in my last year to give, he was in Paris for the year. He worked very much with the people in Paris, and he came and gave some lectures. And I've forgotten how or why I applied for a postdoctoral position at Harvard. But again, miraculously, the telegram came after being turned down by all Cambridge Research Fellowships, offering me this job. And so that was also the other great stroke of luck of my early career, that we moved to Boston after a certain amount of trouble with American visas and so on because in fact we had lived in the Latin Quarter in the year before 68.
Oh.
And it turned out that we were advised that this is how the world has changed. We were advised at that time by Harvard to get an immigrant's visa because there was some sort of quota for Australians. But then it turned out that we couldn't get our immigrant visa because of without a police clearance from everywhere you'd lived. And the French police refused to give a clearance, the security service, to anyone who lived in that part of the Latin Quarter. So this was completely held up for a while, and then fortunately my father-in-law was able to intervene in that he knew the Australian ambassador who spoke to the American ambassador, and somehow or other they arranged to, I think, to waive it or whatever. But it was fortunate because we were expecting our first child then.
Mhm.
And then we arrived in Boston, and they were 3 wonderful years for me. There was no doubt that I found perhaps I was a little more mature then. I don't know why, but also Tate was a great teacher. He is a great teacher. He's still alive, and he started running a seminar on. He'd given a couple of lectures here on Cambridge on an interesting conjecture he had made, which was in some sense simpler than the Boats-Swinnerton-Dyer conjecture, but clearly related to it. And in fact he'd made it with Birch. Birch was a mathematician in Oxford. And he gave this seminar, which was tremendous. You could really, without knowing much about the subject, you could really get your teeth into it. And during that seminar he made a chance remark, which then I've sort of spent the rest of my life more or less developing and living on.
You don't remember the remark, or it wouldn't mean much to us.
Well, he said to me, you see, he discovered, it was very interesting, he discovered in algebraic number theory there were these 2 cases which have gone hand in hand right throughout the 20th century, and one of them is much easier than the other. It's more geometric, and like all these problems I was mentioning to you, the Riemann hypothesis and so on, they were all solved in this other case. But it concerns not the ordinary integers, but a rather different mathematical object. And he found a proof of this conjecture in this easier case. And his chance remark was, he said that a certain Japanese mathematician in Princeton, had he understood, found an analog, some sort of an analog of this thing he was using in the number field case. And that it might be worth looking at to see if there's anything in it.
This is Iwasawa.
Iwasawa, yes, exactly. And of course it was just the beginning. I mean, Iwasawa had already done quite a lot of his work in that direction, although it was only seeing the light of day. He was only publishing a lot of it then, and he was tremendously... Well, so what happened was that Tate made this remark, and I went away, and within just 2 or 3 days, it was sort of obvious that there were, if you looked in Iwasawa's work, there were some things there that strongly indicated that the proof could go up. And so that's how I got started. I mean, I was absolutely convinced. And then he was very helpful in the sense that he hadn't published too much, but he sent me his lecture notes in Princeton.
This is Iwasawa.
Iwasawa did. And from then on, I have to confess, I've spent the rest of my life more or less developing these ideas in some sense. So.
You've worked quite a lot with Japanese mathematicians, haven't you?
Well, really growing out of this, you see, of course I read very carefully then Iwasawa's work, and he was always, as I say, very open with his ideas and everything else, but we never wrote any papers to. I should say then again, I was fortunate in that another student of Tate's who had finished and was at Cornell, had more or less quite independently the same idea as I did. And so and Tate introduced us. He came, I guess, the student came to give a lecture in the seminar. And so we were able to start working together a little bit then too.
What is his name?
Steve Lichtenbaum. So
Can you spell the name?
Lichtenbaum, Lichtenbaum. And but we more or less, and I guess he didn't hear Tate's remark. I mean, I was a little bit lucky that I think he more or less sort of discovered this himself. So we also, that was another thing which helped me along the way, that we then worked together.
I mean, just a sort of further thought about the Japanese work, or people you've worked with in Japan. In mathematics, is it such an international language that it doesn't really matter whether you're Japanese or Chinese or...
Absolutely, it's quite irrelevant. But you see, what's really important is whether the person has access and grows up in that sort of environment, because this part of number theory is highly evolved. You use a lot of machinery and a lot of really everything that grew out of this great German school of mathematics. This algebraic number theory is the sort of is the essential foundations of all of this. So that, for example, the Chinese were at a tremendous disadvantage. So the Japanese were very lucky that they had, in the Meiji era, they sent one of their young people to Germany to study in the school, and he went back and created this great school of number theory that's flourished ever since.
In Tokyo or Kyoto?
Well, yes, he was at Tokyo University, but what happened, and Tokyo University was the center, I guess, until the Second World War. But then, after the Second World War, I suppose life was so, and in fact Iwasawa he had been a product of this school, but he was an assistant professor at Tokyo University during the war, and for that reason, I suppose, did not go off with the army. But he ended up the war, I think, through malnutrition, as very, very ill. And he, like so many of the other Japanese mathematicians of that age group, ended up in the United States in the early 50s. And then he stayed there till maybe 1969. No, even later, sorry. Maybe 1975, I think he finally retired and went back to Tokyo.
The ones you work with now, are they mainly in Tokyo or?
Well, the person I've worked closest with is actually at the moment in Kyoto.
Kyoto.
But he was in Tokyo. He then moved to Kyoto. But there is a whole school now which is spread out over the whole country, and it's one of their major schools of mathematics. Is there another thing? Yeah.
Now we've raised the word Japan, perhaps there's a moment to just divert to your love affair with Japanese ceramics and poetry and literature and many other things. How did that happen?
Well, it was, I guess, in 1976 was the first time, through Iwasawa, I was invited to a conference in Kyoto, and at the peak of springtime. And I went
Cherry
there.
blossom?
Cherry blossoms, everything else. And I went there, of course, interested, but having no real idea of Japan. And it swept me off my feet. I mean, it was really... And Kyoto at that time, I guess, it's still relatively unspoiled, but even the central part was very unspoiled still in 1975. And from that time I really became interested in Japanese art a little bit, although I knew nothing about it, and I began to read a little bit of Japanese literature. Then I guess, I'm trying to remember that at what point I learnt about Whaley's translation of the Tale of Genji. I think, you see, I had read people like Proust earlier, and somehow it was quite late that I came to Japanese literature, but then I'm not sure, it must have probably been maybe about 1978, 79, something like this. I discovered Whaley's translation, and it, of course, is also, it just opens this whole new world to you. And then later, after that, I then began to read unfortunately I can't read Japanese, but I began to read these wonderful, the movement started by Whaley for these wonderful translations of the tankas of the Heian period. And the only thing that's bad about it is it's spoiled my appreciation for Western pottery. But ceramics was relatively late in the sense that it was only when I finally came back to Cambridge that, I mean, I did buy the odd piece, I guess, when I was in Paris, but there wasn't much around. And it was just when I got back to Cambridge that I met, I was always a little bit interested, but then I met someone here who had a shop who was able to get hold of some. And of course, once you see a few of the really good pieces, you realize that it's great art, and you just want to keep trying to get hold of it. But England is unique that way. It wouldn't be possible to make collections of early Japanese ceramics in almost any other country, I suspect, unless you're very wealthy.
We've talked about that, but there's no obvious reason why there are so many private collections of Japanese ceramics coming onto the market in England, whereas not in, I mean, France loved Japan and America, etc.
No, there was obviously, it's unknown why, but there was obviously a much more Japanese, we're talking about the period 1650 to 1750, that in ways that are unexplained still today, there was much greater quality of Japanese porcelain coming to England than elsewhere. It's totally mysterious because there was no official trade.
It came through the Dutch, doesn't it?
Well, I'm not sure. Of course, a lot of it did, but I'm not sure that I'm convinced that that's... I suppose the English East India Company was possibly buying some in China too, and that there was trade from Nagasaki through China, I suspect. Because there has to be something like that, since there are many types of early Japanese porcelain that you find in England, and you do not find in Europe. That's very interesting.
Because some of it would have been left on the way if it had gone through Europe, so it must be a direct connection.
Yeah.
Do you think, I mean, mathematics is about beauty at its heart, and many mathematicians...
Certainly, yes, it's absolutely true.
Beauty is often, I remember hearing mathematicians in King's Fellowship things saying, well, we must elect this person because I don't understand this equation, but it's very, very beautiful. So there's beauty there. There's beauty in Japanese poetry. There's beauty in Japanese ceramics. Do you think there's any crossover in your own mind between these things? I mean, music and mathematics are often thought as mutually refreshing each other, Bach and mathematics.
Yes.
Do you think there could be, I mean, the Eagle, the Gödel, Isha Bach kind of...
No, I think that, I think it's true that in mathematics there is an intellectual beauty that appeals to one, and I think it depends on the individual, but you see intellectual beauty in other things. Certainly, as I say, in Whaley's in a book like The Tale of Genji, certain parts of it there is, and of course it's the great writing of Murasaki to start off with, but then Whaley wrote so beautifully that there is an intellectual beauty there that you're conscious of, and I certainly think that a lot of the high quality early Japanese porcelain was done with as much care and as much a sense of intellectual beauty almost, as well as, or beauty in whatever sense, as you see in the work we would call intellectual. So in that sense, I think there is something in common. And I think that's what part of the charm of Oriental porcelain is. I think that the really high quality work, whether it be Chinese or Japanese, is...
Or Korean.
Or Korean, exactly. That there's a high... Somewhere in there is a real intellectual thought that the artist has put into it. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's come back to what happened at the end of your time in America. Did you stay on there, or did you come back?
Well, what happened was, of course, I had a strictly temporary 3-year position at Harvard. But then I looked around for, of course, like everyone else, I looked around for a permanent job. And I think had I been able to stay at one of the good universities in Boston, I would have stayed in the United States. But there was just no permanent job around there then. In the end, I was offered a permanent job at Stanford. And I went to Stanford, and it was, in many ways, the department was very kind to me. There's no question about that. But the problem was that there was no one in my subject. And at that stage, it's interesting. As you get older in mathematics, I think you feel less the need for having really close collaborators. You always want someone to talk to, I think, or something, but close at hand. I mean, of course, nowadays it's much easier with email. So that influenced me, that I was sort of a little bit unsettled in Stanford. And interestingly, it was also very expensive to buy housing there, which was another factor. I had small children and so on then. And about that time, I got an offer to come back here to a university lectureship in Cambridge. And I had just gone back, I got a Sloan Fellowship in the United States when I'd gone to Paris with it. And my poor wife was really upset in that she wanted to spend the year in Paris, where we had to leave before. And then this job came along in Cambridge, and she had to come over here again. And so I came. So, in fact, for maybe 2 years, we spent half the time here and half the time in Cambridge, in Palo Alto. And then decided. But it was difficult for me, that period, because I felt I had my best mathematical ideas then. You know, this period was just 4 or 5 years after the PhD. But for various reasons, I had taken on a college teaching post at Emmanuel, because I needed the money, and it somehow was one of the nice things of Cambridge. And at that time, we had a heavy lecturing load in the department as a university lecturer. And so I just found I didn't have time to write down the things I really was. I was by that time working on using these ideas of Iwasawa to work on the conjecture of Birch and Swift and Dyer. So that in the end I left after 3 years. I didn't stay very long. I was probably hasty on my part. But I was lucky then. I had my best. I've been fortunate. I had many good research students. My best research student was my research student then in Cambridge when I was very young.
Andrew Weil.
Andrew Wiles, yes.
Can you say something about him? I mean, I presume that Fermat's last theorem is Fermat's last conjecture, is it, so to speak?
Well, of course, Fermat said he had a proof of it, but he never wrote it down. So we have no. And the truth is, I think it's his son who probably claimed it was. He said he had a proof, but there's absolutely zero evidence. He did have the proof for exponent 4, but it's conjecture. Fermat conjecture.
And what was Andrew Wiles who solved this?
Well, it was tremendous. I mean, when I met Andrew, it was Peter Swinnerton Dyer again who, I guess he had taught Andrew in part 3 of the tripos, but then he was heavily involved in university administration. So he said to me, why don't you take this young, I just arrived back in Cambridge, take him on as a research student, he's very good. And it was perfect for me as it worked out, because Andrew was very talented, and we immediately, I said to him, look, I'm trying to, I guess Andrew, we had a conference in Durham in the summer, in which Iwasawa, all these people came. It was a very good conference, as soon as we got back, I said, now we're going to apply these ideas to the Boat-Swinnerton-Dyer conjecture. And it was tremendous, as I say, because he was very bright. He was able to, almost immediately we began to make some progress. And then we really were able to collaborate fully and actually by the time I went to this conference in Japan, which was the next Easter, we announced some results that we were sure we had proven, but the first sort of real theoretical result in the direction of Boat-Swinnerton-Dyer, I just said, we think we can prove it at the end of the lecture. But I guess very shortly after I got back, we were sure, and so it worked out, really worked out perfectly with Andrew that way. And then you see, I was only here for one more year in which, again, we worked further in this direction, extending Ikusawa's work. But as I say, I then became just totally fed up with having too much teaching. And so I went back to Canberra for a little over a year. And then I accepted a job in Paris, in fact. And Andrew went off to Harvard to the same sort of job that I'd had, yes.
Is that where he did his work on Fermat?
Well, I guess he then started on another aspect of Iwasawa's work, which he was able to extend using the idea that there were these two people at Harvard who were the leading number theorists, John Tate and Barry Mazur. And Andrew, even while he was at the end of his time here in Cambridge, he sort of had guessed that the way you could prove what we call the main conjecture, or get at it, was by using some of these ideas of Mazur's. And so they then began to work on that when he went back, when he was in Harvard. And I'm not sure exactly, it's like all these things, many people were working on the Fermat's last theorem side of things. The aspects of it, I guess a number of people were interested in working, but no one, I think where Andrew really had the advantage over everyone else was that he saw that you could really prove the whole thing completely. Whereas in everyone else's mind, I thought, well, you can perhaps prove one little thing here or there. Because I remember Mazur, of course this is now considerably later, because I had by that time come back to Cambridge. But Mazur from Paris, so this is 7 or 8 years later now, came and gave a lecture here, and I was working with another research student of mine on a related issue, and Mazur in his lecture sort of said if only one could do this type of thing, you could get at this famous conjecture. So, but again, it was sort of always in this mentality, I think, that we all thought you could just do one small block of it. And what Andrew saw was you really could put everything together.
But he did this just too late to get a Fields Medal, or a proper one. He got one just after a sort of starred.
That's right. I mean, in fact, he was, in my view, he was very unlucky not to have got one for his work on this proof of the main conjecture of cyclotonic fields that he did with Mazur. But it's always, Fields medals are a complete lottery in that sense, that there are 8 or 10 very good people that the committee looks at carefully in the end, and then they somehow whittle it down. So Andrew was very unlucky. This is before he did Fermat's last theorem, not to have got the Fields medal, in my opinion. But it's interesting, in number theory somehow, I think the most distinguished number theorists have never been awarded Fields medals. For very curious reasons. The people who've really been most influential.
As with Nobel Prizes, no doubt. How big a jump is it to the Sadlerian chair from where we are now? You're in Paris.
Well, you see, I then went to Paris for 8 years. I was professor at the University of Paris, and the last 18 months I spent as director of mathematics at the École Normale. I should have normally stayed there for 5 or 10 years. But, and in fact, we had sort of thought we would probably be in Paris for the rest of our days. But then one day I unexpectedly got a phone call from one of my colleagues who's unfortunately dead now. And he said to me, asked me whether I was interested. I wasn't even aware because Ian Cassell's retired early. And so when the offer came, it was sort of very unexpected. And, I thought about it for a while, and I guess I couldn't resist it in the end.
I mean, it's a very distinguished chair, the earliest chair in pure mathematics in the world. Can you tell me anything else about it?
Well, it's very interesting, the history of the Sadlerian chair. I guess it's one of those things I've meant to look into more carefully, but there's a packet of papers that every Sadlerian professor hands on to his successor, and in those there are some papers including parts of the will of Lady Sadleir. And she, of course, she left the money in 1710 to the university. And it paid, you see, it wasn't a professorship initially, it paid for the lectures in mathematics, and probably most of them, I suspect, until it was made into a professorship in 1860.
It was in algebra, wasn't it? Or was
It's in algebra and geometry is what but clearly someone who, she gives such detailed instructions and has such technical knowledge of mathematics in the will, that someone who knew very much how mathematics was going in the world and how it ought to be taught in Cambridge advised her, and we don't know who that was.
It wasn't Newton. I mean, he was around then, wasn't he?
I don't. Well, that would be very interesting to uncover something like that. The only connection that I know with the academic world was that her first, so sadly it was her second husband. Her first husband was Kroon, a man called Kroon, who was C-R-O-O-N, who was a fellow of Emmanuel College, and was one of the founding fathers of the Royal Society. And of course they still have a Kroonian lecture and things like this, and I suspect that you see, it's a big mystery to why did Cambridge in the early, or whenever it was, 1620 or something like that, start to teach mathematics systematically. Exactly the opposite happened in the University of Paris, for example. And it's a very interesting question that people ought to...
Mathematics was quite an important part of the medieval quadrivium or trivium, whatever it's called.
Yes, but I think that was, a lot of it was what they would call logic, which had nothing to do with mathematics. As far as I know, the first people to teach mathematics systematically in the modern world were the Jesuits in Rome. And for example, Ricci, who went to China, was basically taught mathematics. And I've been told, although I don't know the details, that you can actually, it's like we have our detailed programs for the tripos today, that there are detailed programs of what the Jesuits taught in existence in the Vatican. But that's my theory, that somehow it was, but even politically how the university decided to do it seems a very curious thing. Why should they have so favoured one subject?
Because it was for a long time just about the only examinable subject.
It was just about the only examinable subject. And certainly people like Newton grew out of this school. I mean, it must have been, I don't exactly know when it started, but you see the first products were people like John Wallace, for example. And so the Sadlerian donation is somehow tied up with that. It's a big mystery.
When you came back, you obviously didn't have the teaching load or the undergraduate supervision load that you'd had before.
Yes.
How do you find now, and did you find in the past, Cambridge as a place to do mathematics? I mean, is it a good place?
Well, of course it is.
I should say
I
this
think
is
the first rule of any institution that you live in is to defend it anyway.
Yes, exactly.
But no, I mean, I think it is remarkable that we can still teach mathematics in the same systematic way we always have. I think that I think one of the problems that struck me when I came back to Cambridge was that even though there were some very good mathematicians and mathematics here, there was perhaps a tendency for it to be a little more shut off from the world than it should have been. I think that has changed very much now. I think we solved the physical problems, of course, because since mathematics before the 1960s just operated out of a couple of offices in the art school, there were no proper buildings, and certainly there was just a decaying slum in Mill Lane where we were. So all of those problems have now been solved, and I think the quality of students we still get is outstanding. Part 3 has gone from strength to strength over the last 15 years, when in fact, not long after I came back to Cambridge in the late 80s, when other universities began to do 4-year courses in mathematics, we were seriously worried that numbers might drop who came to do Part 3 from outside Cambridge. But of course that has been true of UK students, but the numbers of outstanding students from Europe and the United States has just gone up and up.
What about the Far East?
The numbers from the Far East is growing, and we do get some very good students from there, but for example, there's still relatively few scholarships for people from China.
That'll change.
Yeah.
What about the college system? Does that help at all? Or
of course, it's fundamental to mathematics, to our undergraduate teaching. And, we could not teach to the same level that we do for such a large number of students if we didn't have college teaching. I think we probably rely on college teaching as much as any subject, perhaps more than any subject. Because that's the big difference, I think, that you notice with what students get out of Cambridge, that even in top American universities, the undergraduates don't have so much opportunity for face-to-face contact with your supervisor or director of studies in college or anything like that. And it's fundamental in ironing out misunderstandings and so on. I think it's an absolute cornerstone of our teaching.
I mean, you said that lectures were perhaps more important in mathematics than in some subjects, but there is also supervision system.
That's what I mean. There's both. You see that, of course, the lectures define what part of that's incorrect. There's a syllabus defining it, but then the lectures cover that material, because mostly it's split through many books and things like this, and I think it's always a pleasure to lecture in Cambridge too, because the undergraduates always keep one on one's toes. Of course, they write terrible things about you at the end of term in your student evaluations and so on, but it is a pleasure like that.
Do you like lecturing?
Very much so. I think for most people it's very important in mathematics to lecture, provided you don't have sort of vast amounts of low-level lecturing which doesn't interest you.
Do you find as you lecture that you have new thoughts?
Usually not. Well, you can, but you see, when you lecture on a subject, I find you get totally absorbed in it anyway, and so you relive it in a way that that's very important. You see, mathematics being, of course, once you've been in the subject a long time, you see in your whole mind you know these areas in and out, like you might know a house inside out, but nevertheless there is this very important part of actually systematically going through a proof or an argument, you see, and you try and do that in your research, but the beauty of lecturing is you do that in parts of mathematics that are well known, and you have to think that out and organize it in your mind beforehand,
And as far as not teaching but your own research, do you find the collegiate system distracts you from it or encourage you? I mean, some people say that the fact that you have to interact with other colleagues at quite a social but high level and explain your subject to other people and so on is helpful.
Well, I enjoy the college system, and I think it is good. I've always tried to be interested in some things outside mathematics. Anyway, I mean, it's not tried. I mean, I've been genuinely interested. I think it is whether it is hard cash for the mathematician, I don't know, but I think the college system certainly is. I mean, the system of teaching that way is fundamental for the fact that we really can train more people to a higher level than anywhere else in the world in mathematics, is because of this dual system.
Where does Cambridge rate in terms of its mathematics?
Well, you see, it's very complicated, because I think as an undergraduate teaching institution, I think we can claim to be as good as anywhere else in terms of producing really people who turned out to be very original. And probably only our serious competitors are, in a much more limited way, say in pure mathematics, would be somewhere like the École Normale or Harvard, perhaps, as an undergraduate institution. Now, of course, there are outstanding individual students everywhere, but for a large group of students, we're really quite different from perhaps the University of Tokyo too. After that, I mean, at the research level, I think we do very well. In some sense, until recently, we haven't had the financial resources to perhaps hire the most outstanding people at the permanent level, whether they be, university lectureship or upwards. But that's changing now. I think that's a tremendously positive thing for Cambridge, that we now, and one thing which I'm very proud to have pushed for and had a long fight over when I was head of department, was we've now adopted totally the American system, that all of our tenured faculty teach exactly the same. University lecturers up, everyone teaches exactly the same amount, because I've always felt the old system was wrong somehow, where the professors could somehow do just what they wanted, and the university lecturers were left with a heavy load, in fact.
There was one last question, just a small question I often ask, which is that if you were advising a young person coming to university to do mathematics or at the PhD level, is there any sort of particular advice you'd give them? I mean, you mentioned the difficulties nowadays because of the vast expansion of the field of pure mathematics.
Well, no, but I think I consider myself very fortunate to be able to spend my life doing mathematics, and I'm sure there are many other intellectual subjects like that, but it's true, it requires long hours of work and concentration, but the rewards are very great, I think, and if you like that sort of thing, I think anyone should still try and pursue it, definitely. And I think the world needs mathematics and mathematicians.
That's a lovely point to end on. Thank you very much indeed, John.
Pleasure.